I see my guest in the background, so I'm going to bring my guest in. He is a favorite of mine, John Helmer. How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
Thank you for having me, Jamal. Good to see you again.
No, it's good to see you too, and thank you for joining me. John Helmer, he is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own independent bureau absent of national or commercial ties. He is a regular presenter on Russian topics in China, Western Europe, the United States, has published several books in the United States on military and political topics, including essays on American presidency and on urban policy in the United States, followed in book compilations in 1981 and 1982, essays on Greek and Middle Eastern politics between 1986 and 1989. Since 1989, he's published almost exclusively on Russian topics, and you can find much of his work on Dances with Bears. It is a fantastic, I guess you could say, it's, I guess, a slash between a podcast, a newsletter, and all of his, let's say, media engagements, or at the very least, most of them, I tend to find on this page. It is damn good. So, John, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I guess the first question is something that you wrote about in your piece on Bondi Beach. And I was listening to one of your interviews with Nima, and you made this distinction between the way that Russia engaged it as terrorism, as opposed to, let's say, a hate act or a hate crime.
Yes.
What is the distinction between these two things, and why do you think Russia defined it as terrorism as opposed to a hate crime? I found it to be interesting when you broke it down.
Well, let's take it nice and calmly and begin with the fact that no one is disputing a terrible crime was committed. Mass murder. 16 people at the moment confirmed dead, and more than 20 people in hospital, some of whom may succumb. We hope they don't. So There's no argument from me that on the evidence, and we've got to take the evidence very quietly and carefully, on the evidence, Sajid Akram, father, and Navid Akram, son, committed mass murder. And as you said, the question then becomes, under the law of the state where the acts were committed on Bondi Beach, is this terrorism? Is it anti-Semitism? Is anti-Semitism a hate crime? What were their motives? And so on. Now, the law in Australia is very clear. It's in the Terrorism Police Powers Act of 2002 in the state of New South Wales, where Sydney is based, where the Bondi acts were committed, and it's in the federal law. And it's not very different anywhere else. And it says, and I'll read it, so forgive me, Jamal, and our audience, when I look down and desks covered with papers. It's better to do this stuff on radio. So a terrorist act means, and I'm quoting the statute, an action where the act is done with the intention of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause, and is done with the intention of coercing or influencing by intimidation the government of the Commonwealth, or a state or territory of foreign country, or part of a state, territory, or foreign country, and or intimidating the public or a section of the public. Now, it's one issue which we can get into on what the law is by which Navid Akram, the survivor, is going to be put on trial. He's, as I understand it, been charged with 15 offenses, but only one terrorism offense. I may be wrong about that. He's been charged with murder, several counts of. It's one issue to determine what they did was terrorism. It's another issue to determine whether it was anti-Semitic. And a third issue, whether they are in any way associated with any known terrorist organization. All of those issues aren't legal ones. They're evidential and they're also political. And Australia has a very peculiar and entirely political operation, which is called AVTOP. It's the Australian Victim of Terrorism Overseas Payment Scheme, AVTOP. That's when the government determines that if Australians are killed or injured abroad in acts which the government determines to have been terrorism, the survivors or the family are eligible for $75,000 in compensation. The problem is that the Prime Minister by himself, in secret, with discretion, not subject to parliamentary vote or public discussion, decides when an act abroad is terrorism and when it's not. Now, the Prime Minister, then Malcolm Turnbull, decided that when 38 Australians were killed in Malaysia Airlines MH17, shot down over eastern Ukraine in July 2014, that was not terrorism. Now, this has never been debated in public. I reported in Dances with Bears some time back. The secret papers to Prime Minister were that what happened to MH17 was an act of war, civil war within Ukraine and war between states, Russia and the Ukraine. Now, that was a dramatic and essentially secret, had to be secret judgment that stopped the payment of compensation to the Australians. 298 people were killed in that incident because it wasn't terrorism, the Australian government ruled. That ran completely counter to the Ukrainian view that it had been terrorism, that the rebellion against Kiev in the Donbass was terrorism. That was the Ukrainian line, supported by the United States, supported by the NATO allies, as you know very well. The Australian government didn't take that view. It took the view in October 2023 that the Hamas breakout and operation against Israel was terrorism. And the Prime Minister ruled that any Australian, dual citizen, Israeli-Australian, who was injured or killed in that series of events related to the Hamas operation, that was terrorism. But when an Arab Australian, Palestinian Australian was killed in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces, that's not being considered terrorism. That's war. So what have we got here? We've got the notion that terrorism has to have a cause behind it, has to have a theory, it has to have an ideology, it has to be violent. Second, it's usually or always associated with others, groups. Yeah? It's not war between states. When states sponsor groups to commit violence, as in the Crocus City Hall act in Moscow, which killed more than 140 people, it was the Ukrainian state, and behind it, the US and British and other secret services employing a group of Tajik individuals associated with ISIS-K, an organization, to do the killing. We know all of that, and Russia's made it clear. What Russia doesn't make clear is when state-sponsored terrorism is terrorism or an act of war. Okay? Now, India makes it very clear that when terrorists killed 26 people at Pahalgam in Kashmir last April, it was Pakistan directed, Pakistan financed, Pakistan planned, state-planned act of terror. And the Indian retaliation, Operation Sindoor, significantly damaged Pakistan's command and control, so it begged for ceasefire from the United States. That was a war. When the Red Fort attack blew up and killed, I think, at least 15 people recently in Delhi, this was also a state-sponsored terrorist act. Now, so some states make no bones about state-supported terrorism being part of a state form of warfare. Let's look exactly at what the Chinese said. The Chinese government issued a statement, was asked on the 15th in a foreign ministry briefing how it responded to the Bondi shooting. The question was, in the Beijing foreign ministry briefing, a mass shooting occurred in Sydney and caused heavy casualties. Can I have your comment on that? The spokesman for Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Guo Jiakun, said, and this is exactly and all the Chinese said, Foreign Minister Wang Yi sent a message of condolences to Minister for Foreign Affairs Penny Wong over the incident. China mourns for the victims and expresses sympathies to the bereaved families and the injured. That's what the Chinese government said. It wasn't short of intelligence or information on what had happened. But let's look at what the Russian government foreign ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova said. I'll read it out. So pardon me for looking down. Quotes from Zakharova. It was with deep sorrow that the news of the terrorist attack in Sydney during the celebration of Hanukkah in the Bondi beach area was perceived. We strongly condemn the barbaric extremist attack, which resulted in 15 innocent civilians, including a 10-year-old girl, killed, dozens injured. As it became known, I'm still reading from what Zakharova said. Among the victims of the terrorist attack, unfortunately, there are our compatriots who are permanently residing in Australia. We are invariably in favor of the uncompromising fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. We call for the joint efforts of all countries of the world to jointly rebuff this barbarism. That's a pretty extraordinary difference, you'll admit, with the Chinese analysis. Why? Well, in the first place, when Zakharova said what she said, there was insufficient evidence to determine whether these were terrorists or mass murderers. We're not minimizing what they did. We're not in any way sympathizing with what they did. But why call it terrorism from the tribune of the Russian Foreign Ministry when China didn't? Then what we've got is something very unusual. There are our compatriots among the victims. What's that mean? Well, let me go into what that means because it's not discussed. The meeting, the Hanukkah ceremony was a ceremony organized by Chabad, a Jewish organization, which included Bondi Beach. It has long been a concentration of Jewish people living there. And Chabad was organizing this festival. Chabad is an organization that is profoundly anti-Russian, anti-Christian. I'll say it again, anti-Russian, anti-Christian. It has long pursued proselytizing efforts in order to mobilize Jews who left the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. It calls them refugees from Soviet brutality. It has, in the last, since 2022, Chabad has taken Ukraine's side in the war against Russia. the Ukrainian branch of Chabad has been financed by Kolomoisky, Igor Kolomoisky. Everybody should know that Igor Kolomoisky not only financed Chabad and the Menorah Center in Dnipropetrovsk, but financed the Azov battalions, the most fascist Nazi, racially anti-Russian military groups in the Ukrainian forces. Now, what sort of organization does Zakharova, representing the Russian Foreign Ministry, call compatriot? There's no doubt that the residents that were affected by this attack and hurt or killed by this attack consider themselves Russian speakers. But and I invite the audience, I've done it myself, go through the Australian Jewish News Archive, go through the Israeli Press Archive, and go through the Chabad Lubavitcher Archive. And what do you find? These people, this organization, identifies itself as Russian-speaking Jews. It does not identify itself as compatriot with anyone in Moscow. It's opposed to them. It fights against them in the Ukraine. Now, there's a very interesting thing that I invite our audience to do, and that's to look at what the record of Rabbi Eli Schlanger. Schlanger was the most senior Chabad figure who was killed in the attack. He was murdered. I'm not minimizing the crime of killing Rabbi Eli Schlanger. But Eli Schlanger has made a record of his anti-Christian, anti-Russian, pro-Kiev regime views. We don't have time to go through them, but I've got a whole section of them, and our audience can do it simply by going to the Australian Jewish News and putting in Eli Schlanger, Schlanger. Now, Schlanger has done a number of very interesting things. He doesn't deserve to be murdered. He didn't deserve to die. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is this man cannot be described as a compatriot of Russia unless the Foreign Ministry of Russia or Maria Zakharova regards every enemy of Russia who happens to speak Russian to be a
patriot.
Yes, that's absurd and ridiculous. What Schlanger said in the history of his family is that his family comes from Zhostek. Zhostek is a village that lies between Krakow and Lvov. And during the period 42 to 43, when the German army occupied Poland and ran that southern section of Poland and the western section of Ukraine as a gouvernement, they liquidated Poles and Jews and Russians, right? Everybody understands that the Holocaust involved the killing of Jews in that area, as well as Russians and Poles. But Zhostek was attacked, and the family of Schlanger were murdered by Ukrainians, by Bandera Ukrainians, fascists then. The record is clear. Why then should Schlanger deny Ukrainian direct involvement in the deaths of his own family? Answer: there's ample evidence that the Chabad Lubavitcher rabbis are deeply supportive. They've done it visually. They've had meetings with the Zelensky regime and with its fascist elements. One should ask them why. I'm not here to explain to you why what I then raise is the question, if that's Schlanger's record, if that's the, let's say, operational ideology of the Chabad movement, what did they do after the Hamas operation began October 7, 2023? Answer, they supported Israeli operations in Gaza. They support the genocide. And not only that, but Schlanger wrote a letter to the Australian Prime Minister. I'm shuffling papers here so I can read it to you.
You're fine.
A month before his death, he called on Prime Minister Albanese not to recognize the Palestinian state. He called that a crime against God. I'm using his words.
Wow.
I'll just read you what he wrote in his letter to the Prime Minister of Australia. As a rabbi in Sydney, Schlanger said, I implore you not to betray the Jewish people and not God himself. This land, meaning Gaza, Palestine, was given by God to Abraham, then to his son Isaac, and then to Jacob to be the eternal homeland of the Jewish people. Throughout history, Jews have been torn from their land again and again by leaders who are now remembered with contempt in the pages of history. He called the Australian government's recognition of Palestine's state act of betrayal, apostasy. Now, that's an ideology. We could say we disagree with it or we agree with it. But that's an ideology. The Chabad rabbi and others of his organization advocated violence to remove the Palestinian Arabs from Palestine, including Gaza. Okay? Now, that's not a record that anyone right now wishes to remember about one of the victims or the organization that these two Akram family members attacked. Let's just go back a minute. What they did was mass murder. It's a terrible crime. But what the organization they attacked represents is the support of genocide against the Palestinians. And in Schlanger's case, a very odd blindness to the genocide committed by the Ukrainian Banderist movements in 42-43 and continued today as a campaign against Russia, against Slavs, against Orthodox Christians. Now, to go back to the point, Zaharova should not have described these people, these Russian-speaking, self-identifying Russian-speaking Jews as compatriots, or she needs to explain why. When the Chinese government looked at it, it described an incident of murder, terrible crime. So there's a lot here that goes to the politics of how to interpret what's happened. That's, on the one hand, information warfare, controlling the narrative. You've interviewed, I think, Tim Anderson from Sydney, yes. And he makes the point that blame the Israeli government in blaming the Australian government for recognizing Palestine as a state is leading to anti-Semitic acts like this, that anti-Semitic acts include not only killing, but political actions like recognizing the state of Palestine. They don't discriminate any longer. In fact, the pressure inside Australia, as I understand it, from the Jewish community is to make all forms of criticism of Israel, illegal. All the genocide, or all the doctrines that Schlanger himself represented in his letters to be criminal. You can't say what I've just said unless you face a court of law. That's what these people want to make criminal. Now, that's, call it one of the post-incident, post-murder manipulations of the politics of the event. But it's very important to understand that the two Akrams who committed these murders, father who's dead, our son who's in hospital facing the charges and will be tried, it's very important to understand the question with which you began. And the Australian press is now in this narrative control warfare, with one form of information suggesting that they had ties to terrorist groups. No evidence whatsoever has emerged of that. The Philippines government has pointed out what they know. They were followed, they were watched in their hotel room in Mindanao last month, where they spent nearly a month. No contacts with known terrorists, known organizations in Mindanao. The Philippines government has fought terrorism, Islamic terrorism, in its country, and knows a good deal more about it than the Australian press, or than I do. But they're on record as saying no evidence whatsoever of terrorist organizational contacts in the Philippines. That leaves only one item that is supposedly indicative of the Akram's terrorist ideology, the black handmade ISIS flag. Now, as you've pointed out in your valuable program, Jamal, that ISIS is not pro-Palestinian. It's not, it's anti-Iranian. It's not any of the things that the Israelis are trying to press as their interpretation of what has happened. President Trump didn't, in his remarks about the event, call it a terrorist action. He called it an anti-Semitic action, and let's agree he's right. These two men fired only at Jews. You can watch the video where Naveed Akram shoos bystanders away because they weren't in the Jewish part of the beach where the ceremony was that they were attacking. Yes, they targeted Jews. The Indian government in Hyderabad, the police, which monitor terrorist operations very closely, much more closely and intensively than the Australians do, have not identified any terrorist action. There's another problem. Sajid Akram was a professional. He was university trained. He had a Bachelor of Commerce in Hyderabad. Not a single reference has been made in the Australian press that I found of what his occupation was, what he did for a living, how he lived. None of the press have dug up any evidence that they had associations of an ideological, political kind, or that they acted in a way that intimidated. I'm using the language of the terrorist law. And yet they committed mass murder, and they aimed it at a particular Jewish group. No doubt about what that evidence says, but what it means, very, very different. And Chabad needs to be understood in the Ukraine war context, in the history of the mass murder by the Germans and the Ukrainians in Poland between 42 and 43. And Chabad has to be understood in the Gaza genocide context, because Schlanger went there and expressed his solidarity visually and in writing with IDF troops, and you can see the videos and you can see the records. So you've got a very much more complicated picture of war between Jewish people and Arab people, between Jewish religionists and Muslim religionists. So last point, not to test your patience too long. There are more than 1 million Muslims.
You're fine.
There are more than 1 million Muslims in Australia. There are 110,000 Jewish people. They are concentrated in Melbourne and Sydney. Not only that, they're highly concentrated in living areas, in suburbs. And the Muslim population is so concentrated that in 10 electorates of the state of Victoria and the state of New South Wales, in Melbourne and in Sydney, in 10 electorates, Muslim concentrations go from 15% to more than 35%. They can make or break elections. Okay? Wow. Jewish population, much smaller, also concentrated among places where they're concentrated as in living spaces. Bondi Beach is one of them. Less well-off Jewish people live in Bondi. Very well-off people, Jewish people, live in Bellevue Hill. This is all census material. It's all been studied. It's all been published. None of it comes out now. But this is the politics in Australia, and it's got comparable parallels with Europe and the United States. Jewish concentration is between about 5% and 15% of electorates. Maybe in certain cases they can have an effect on an election, but nothing like the Muslim vote could. Okay? So we have this incident feeds into the politics of the context. It's the Muslim population versus the Jewish population. And in the future of Australia, and it's the same in France, it's the same in the UK, it's the same in Germany, and it's the same in the United States. In the future, Muslim votes will outvote Jewish votes. Now, this is an urgent problem, political problem, for Jewish people to solve. And that's why narrative control regarding this event has to take the particular form that makes Muslims threats to political stability, makes speech that Muslims make in criticism of the genocide, in criticism of Israel, makes that criminal speech, hate speech. Then what do you expect if this is the context? It's not just Australia. That's why I think it's worth our talking out. The facts on the ground, the law on the ground, and the meaning of Chabad there, attacked by an Indian Muslim from Hyderabad and his son born in Australia, of an Indian-Italian couple. Okay, why did they do this? They haven't said. They apparently left no notes. There's no video. There's just the black flag. And it's not so clear where that flag came from.
That brings an interesting question in regards to Zaharova. Why would she call these people compatriots? I mean, if it's just people who speak Russian, then Zelensky is a compatriot because he predominantly speaks Russian. Correct. Is it because of the relationship with Israel? I mean, I have Middle Eastern guests, and those guests often decry this idea of Russia's relationship with Israel. Is that where that's coming from? This kind of a dog whistle?
Let Maria Zakharova answer your question. I'm not going to. She's invited several well-known podcasters from the United States to be her guest in Moscow. And they don't dare ask the Israel question. Okay? Now, everybody political in Moscow knows the answer to your question, Jamal.
Uh,
There is an unusual relationship between the president of Russia and Israel. And he doesn't discuss it.
why not?
Therefore,
I mean, I'm fascinated by that. By the way, he has discussed it at least once when when there was pressure on Russia. Effectively, Putin was getting very annoyed with people saying that he abandoned his friends in relation to Iran, and he pointed
and
out
Syria and the
in Syria,
Assad.
exactly, and he pointed out that like 30% of Israelis were Russian. Like he did,
Compatriot, same term,
yeah.
yes.
So he did hit it, maybe not overtly,
No,
but he alluded
look,
to it.
it's an important point. It's almost, I may be wrong, but I don't see any discussion challenging why the large proportion of Russian-speaking Israeli Jews are termed compatriot and influencing Russian policy towards Israel. I haven't seen a discussion of that. We know, for example, that much of the opposition to President Putin, Leonid Nevzlin, for example, is one of those compatriots, is he? He's the partner in UCAS of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Well, Khodorkovsky doesn't live in Israel. By the way, Igor Kolomoisky lived in Israel until he came back to Ukraine, and now he's in prison. But let's leave out the dual nationality part. It's a very similar problem. How much of that Israeli population, Russian-speaking Jewish population in Israel, are anti-Russian, that supported the Navalny campaign, that supported Boris Berezovsky's campaign, that supported Mikhail Khodorkovsky's campaign? Does Zakharova call Khodorkovsky a compatriot? I don't think so. So we go back to your question, and I'm not able to answer it. All I can point at, your question is, why does having Russian-speaking Jews in Israel represent let's call it a constituency for President Putin to adopt in such a way as to raise the question why, and he hasn't answered why. I can tell you, historically, there was a good reason. Historically, why did Stalin support the formation of the State of Israel? Very clearly, as an anti-colonial strike at the British. That was Stalin's view. Nobody accuses Stalin of being philo-Semitic. He's being accused of being terribly anti-Semitic. At much the same time, between 48 and 51, Stalin is equally accused of being pro-Israel. Yes, he was, against the British, and anti-Semitic against Jews inside the cultural, intellectual, university, and other institutions of the Soviet Union. So nobody doubts Stalin's anti-Semitic credentials, you might say. But he had a particular reason for supporting the formation of the State of Israel. And those who criticize Stalin for that don't understand and don't want to accept that it was an anti-imperialist move. Why then in the 70s did Soviet policy favor Jewish emigration? The answer is very clear. In dealing with the United States, Soviet policy needed to concede Jewish emigration in return for various important trade and trade financing benefits that the Soviet Union needed then. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which facilitated the exit of Soviet Jews, was part of a Soviet policy calculation that one of the ways to mitigate anti-Soviet war policy in Washington was through the Jewish lobby. Okay, so there's a long history. It's complicated. It changes from year to year, and it's an interactive story between Russian calculation in Moscow and calculation about how to influence in a pro-Soviet or pro-Moscow or pro-Kremlin direction Washington policy. And the perceptions were that American Jews would be more amenable to détente with the Soviet Union than others. So
Right.
now we could argue, was that calculation mistaken? And certainly, is that calculation mistaken today? But there's a history there, and it's a history that shouldn't be caricatured, isn't a cartoon.
Okay, that's mind blowing. I mean, because like if you're looking at Israel today, and that's where this wasn't where I thought we were going to linger, but I'm curious about this. Israel's relationship with the United States, they're effectively the proxy. They're the thing that is breaking up the Middle East and allows the U.S. projection power in the Middle East, kind of like NATO
Yes.
in Europe.
Yes.
So you would think that the relationship between Russia and Israel would be more toxic than what it is, considering
You would think
Israel's
so.
role and relationship with the U.S.
Yes. You would think so. Yes.
But it doesn't work that way in practice.
Well, it's factional. It's factional. The general staff were bitterly opposed to the limitations placed on their bases and their their operations with the Syrians for air defense. They were bitterly opposed to the restriction that they were not to activate their advanced missile systems when Israeli aircraft attacked Syria, attacked the Assad regime. And in one particular case, I wrote about it. I never get the details in my head all clear, but in the notorious case, what the Israeli Air Force did was to spoof Syrian missile batteries into firing on a Russian reconnaissance aircraft coming in to land at Khmeimim.
Right.
That killed every Russian serviceman on board. And when it happened, I'm sorry, I can't keep all these details in his old head of mine. I believe it was 2018, but I might be a little wrong.
I remember this. Yeah, I remember this actually.
What happened was there's no doubt the Israelis understood that the Syrians could be fooled into seeing the Russian aircraft as if it was an Israeli one, and they shot it down. The general staff explicitly issued a statement accusing Israel of responsibility for the deaths of the Russian crew and the crash of the aircraft. But President Putin met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Paris with no other Russian official there and only one interpreter, and made a deal with Netanyahu, which the details of which were never revealed, but essentially amounted to no, not even, as I understand it, not even Israeli compensation for the deaths of the Russian servicemen. No admission of blame, no admission of responsibility, nothing. Nichevo. So, in reporting that episode, what you could see was a serious factional break between General Staff and Defense Ministry on the one hand, and President Putin and advisors in the Kremlin on the other. And in the middle there was Foreign Minister Lavrov. The Foreign Ministry tends in these matters to take the General Staff position, but camouflage that in favor of the Kremlin position. So this is a very difficult factional problem to be solved. And it's been difficult throughout President Putin's term.
Is this specific to Putin? Meaning, if Putin leaves, that whoever comes in, be it Medvedev or somebody else, is going to have a different point of view that is more, let's say, geopolitical, as opposed to this kind of, I guess, personal affections? Or is that even unknown?
I believe the answer to that's yes.
Okay. Wow. That is mind-blowing, John. That is mind-blowing. This has confused the hell out of me. This relationship has confused me.
No, I mean, look, Jamal, you're asking all the right questions. I don't believe what I'm saying is any news to most politically acute people in Moscow. I mean, they can't say it, but everybody understands there's a particular problem. Okay, 1. 2, it manifests itself in these freakish events. I mean, the other day, Foreign Minister Lavrov gave a very interesting interview to Iran state radio, if I'm not mistaken. And they didn't hesitate to ask questions about the collapse of the Assad regime and what it means for Iran. And they asked, can we rely on you? Can Iran rely on you, on Russia, Mr. Lavrov, if there's another round of Israeli attack? And Lavrov said something very, very odd. In describing the downfall of the Assad regime, he claimed that the advance out of Idlib, the breakout, was a surprise to Russia. Hey, wait a minute. Sorry. It was, if that's true, Russia has no military intelligence capability. That's preposterous. It has one of the best military intelligence capabilities in the world, and it's performing every day on the battlefield against everything the United States and NATO throws at it. Oh, no. It was no surprise that the Turks had been preparing the breakout of Giuliani and his gang for a long time. And it's not published, or I published it. It's no surprise that the general staff had many different views, or had views that were different from the Kremlin about what was to be done. Should the Russian side attempt blocking or deterrent action as Giuliani's Turkish-assisted breakout started out of Idlib and moved south towards Latakia, towards Khmeimim, towards Tartus. But for the foreign minister to say it was a surprise is simply not true. And to say it to the Iranians is extraordinary. They know it's not true. And the question was, how can we rely on you? So to tell them something as untrue, as obviously untrue as that, adds to the non-credible nature of what you've just said. It undermines yourself. How can the foreign minister, as experienced as Mr. Lavrov is, say that? Answer: Lavrov wasn't at all happy, wasn't any happier than the General Staff or the Security Council at the decision that was reached to abandon Assad, to let Giuliani and the Turks move south. And I remember vividly that Lavrov as government spokesman, as the events were developing in the first days of December of that year, indicated he was profoundly upset at what was happening and at the decision, not on the Russian side, not to oppose, not to resist. Anyway, that's all water under the bridge. Now we have a strategic gone.
Well, I'm sorry. I was going to say Iran doesn't think there's water under the bridge because they're asking that particular question. And the response that they got was, let's say, lackluster from their point of view. I mean, because what Iran is asking, and what a lot of people are asking that are paying attention to this stuff, especially this kind of geopolitical fulcrum between China or Russia, and
India,
right? China, Russia, India, and Iran, are these countries going to work together to push back against, let's say, Western aggression and Western hegemony? And so when Iran is asking that question, they're looking for security. Hey,
correct.
Will you back us when they attack us again? And what they got from Lavrov was something that was patently untrue. I mean, Kevork, who does Syrian analysis, was saying for weeks beforehand, this is going to explode. This is going to explode. They're going to attack. They're going to attack. Meaning, how did he know? But Russian intelligence didn't know.
Well, let's agree that Russian intelligence did know. And second, that a political decision was made
to allow
not to resist on the road. And then it became difficult when the US weighed in. Iran wanted to fly in forces to Khmeimim, and the US said, do that and we'll shoot you down. So, look, there's much more to the story, and I'm not prepped to remember all the details, okay? There's a lot there, but it's not simply Iran asking the question, can we rely on you, sir, President of Russia, Foreign Minister of Russia, Defense Minister of Russia, can we rely on you if the attack comes again? And Iran has asked that. India has asked that. We've talked about that on this program before. If there's a clash between India and China, which side will Russia tilt toward? And you can be sure the Chinese ask the question in the obverse direction. And then there's the question about Venezuela. Now, each of those situations is profoundly different. And maybe we don't have time. We just hit the hour. On the top of the screen, I see it, and maybe our audience wants to see more blood on the floor.
Well, this is nearly 1,000 people, so this is a riveting conversation. Like as you point out, this is not.
I don't mean to be. Hey, Jamal, I don't mean to be riveting. I'm just trying to tell a little of the truth here.
No,
and invite folks to say, look at the evidence.
Yeah.
Look at the evidence, and look at the law, and look at the political context in which each of these events is playing out, from Bondi Beach to Tehran to the shores of Venezuela. And okay, I'm a Russia correspondent, and I don't purport to be an expert on any of these other places, but you ask the questions from Russian point of view, I'm trying to give the answers. And the stunning thing to me, quite apart from the problem Mrs. Zaharova has with the word compatriot, is everybody who speaks French a compatriot of France? Is everybody who speaks English compatriots? Of course not. Okay, that's one issue. But how come the Chinese had such little to say? Wasn't it safer to say little at the time when Guo Jiakun said, "We send message of condolences over the incident." They weren't characterizing the politics of the incident. They didn't want to get into the narrative control issue.
Wow. This is mind-blowing. Like, it's on so many levels.
You're going to take your hat off?
Well, I've had people who analyze Middle Eastern politics.
Yeah.
And they've said similar things to what you've just said. And I have had disbelief on those things, if I'm being bluntly honest. Because from my point of view, the relationship between Russia and Syria, they would have wanted Syria to maintain itself.
Yes, they did. Yes.
But it sounds like a political decision was made for it to fall.
No. I wouldn't put it that way. And I've heard several of your guests put it in a way that I think is unfair to the way the Russian decision was made.
Okay, please explain that.
Well, as I said, I think the general staff and the military intelligence, and possibly SVR, the foreign intelligence service, took the view that it might have been possible or should have been possible to deter the Jilani breakout.
Oh, I see.
Then there's an argument. And let's ask ourselves how we would decide it if we were President Putin. On the one side, we know for weeks that the Turks are preparing Jilani for a breakout. The Dagataris are pumping the money in. The weapons are going in. The weapons are inconsistent with the agreements reached between Putin and Erdogan for constraining and limiting Idlib for what it was. No breakout allowed. But the Turks are extremely important in Russian tactics and operations and strategy for fighting the war against the US, NATO, for fighting the world on the Ukrainian battlefield. So if you're sitting around a table, let's suppose we're the table and we're the officials talking, we're at war with the world's at war with us, and we need the Turks now. If we do anything to strike the Turks, we seriously damage our priority interest. Then somebody pipes up and says, yes, but we have a strategic interest in showing we are reliable allies. We must not let Assad go down, because that will affect our strategic relationships all around the world, not just Damascus, but Tehran, Beijing, Delhi, and so on. We have, and so they have a discussion. And are we so clear that we would know how to sacrifice, how to compromise? It's easy to be so much wiser after the event. But one of the problems I have with some of your Arab analysts is when they leave Arab politics, Syria they're expert on, Lebanon they're expert on, Palestinian politics they're expert on. But when they try to project from the way Russian decision-making looks from their expertise, they make some mistakes. I don't know that I'd call it a mistake. Misunderstandings. Why? And it's understandable. I've been out of Arab politics for a long time now, so I wouldn't dare project backwards from the Arab politics I knew very well at the Arab League back in the 1980s and early 90s. I'm gone from there. Okay, so I don't pretend to understand the intricacies and the way in which around a table something as crucial as the decision, do we stop the Turks? Can we deter the Turks? Can we hit Jilani or not? That argument was argued. There's no doubt about that. And we also know how it ended. But I don't think one should conclude that Russia reached that decision easily or with cowardice.
Great breakdown. That fantastic breakdown, John. Like, honestly, fantastic breakdown, bar none. This has been a deep curiosity of mine that I didn't quite get. I am glad that you were willing to step into that and explain that openly, and the way you explained it makes all the sense in the world. Like I said, I was doubtful of their analysis of this because, but your explanation of it makes it make sense in a way that I think people can grasp and they can get their heads around, as opposed to Russia just gave up the ghost in this case. Oh, great breakdown. I swear, great breakdown. One last question before I let you go. There is a Russian tanker headed to Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is going to happen with this? Is that tanker going to turn around? Is that tanker going to try to battle through?
I was, I don't know. What we have, and I'm looking on both sides of my desk, I'm looking at, on the one hand, one side of me, I've got President Trump's tweet declaring, a tight blockade against sanctioned tankers. The qualification's not insignificant there. Mm-hmm. Second, we know that the Russian tankers coming into Venezuela, if they're loaded, usually have been carrying naphtha. And naphtha is used to combine with the heavy Venezuelan crude, so it's easier to refine and therefore cheaper at destination. Is what's happening a sanctioned tanker or an unsanctioned tanker carrying naphtha? Is it an empty tanker coming to upload? And is that a sanctioned tanker or an unsanctioned tanker? And is the challenge here not just the Russian tanker, but the final destination? Right. I think one has to understand that these so-called dark tankers are not carrying Venezuelan crude just to Cuba. They're carrying it principally to China. So the blockade that's been threatened by Trump is in fact a strike not only against already sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil and the so-called black tanker fleet of Russia. Not only them, it's a blow against China. China's the buyer. Chinese refineries optimizing for the discounts and the low price the oil will fetch because of the gauntlet running elements of the trade. The Chinese refineries are the buyers. So what's happening is not only a threat against Russia, which at this very moment is trying to negotiate. We could get into that a bit with Witkoff and Kushner, trying to negotiate terms of settlement of the Ukraine war. So that remains a priority for Russia. Russia clearly doesn't want a confrontation in the Caribbean with the U.S. Navy right now. China is, when it comes to paper tigers, really the Chinese lead the world in papering over their tigrific capacities. They don't have any capacity to put their guns where their mouths are. And this is regrettable from a great power point of view, and it's exploited by Trump. On the other hand, the Chinese capacity to use their trade weapons, that's tough, that's pretty good. They forced concessions again from the United States. So I don't know what kind of tanker this is coming. I don't know if it's got naphtha on board, and I don't know if to what extent we could call it a Russian target or a Chinese target.
We're stuck waiting and seeing, basically.
Look, what both the Chinese and the Russian side have demonstrated under the US trade war gun is workaround, ingenuity to find the way around the sanction. And they're doing that very well. And of course, it cuts revenue in the short term in propaganda agencies like Bloomberg and Reuters. It looks as if the sanctions are having effect. You see, and I think you mentioned it before we went to air, that Seymour Hersh has written a piece making ridiculously inaccurate claims about the desperation that the Russian side is under to reach an agreement. I mean, the workarounds are effective. The sanctions for short-term and long-term and medium-term failing.
And this will also effectively fail. I mean, I guess your point is this will also fail.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
I guess your point is this will also ultimately fail. This is not going to ultimately work.
Well, many of your guests and many in the podcast audience and even the mainstream media understand that what Trump's doing is trying to provoke a Gulf of Tonkin incident, a fight back, some incident in which an official Venezuelan force fires on a U.S. Military entity, whether it be a plane or a U.S. Navy vessel, that would trigger a major, massive U.S. retaliation, bombing, possible troop landing, that sort of thing. To trigger a Gulf of Tonkin long after the Venezuelans and everybody else in the world have learned what the Gulf of Tonkin was as a provocation and what happened to the U.S. in the Vietnam War. It's going to fail. But failures can be extremely destructive and damaging to the target country and also to the U.S. as the offensive or attacking country in this case.
Yeah.
So it's clear the Chinese want to avoid confrontation over Venezuela. It's clear that Russia wants to avoid confrontation. It's also clear that Russia is doing a hell of a lot more than the Chinese to build up the Venezuelan capacity to defend and deter from within and on their shores. And
John, I'm sorry, we're going to have to end it on that one.
Okay.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I have deeply enjoyed this conversation, and I have to have you back to continue with this, especially with the negotiations and everything else. We didn't get the opportunity to get into it, but I've been riveted by this. Thank you for this, honestly.
Thank you for having me, Jamal. If we end on the corpse of Seymour Hersh, so be it.
Yeah, he has not necessarily been at his best in his later years, to put it mildly.
This latest story is a plant to make Secretary of State Rubio look good. It's ridiculous in making claims that about the negotiations on the U.S. side, and it's ridiculous in the claims on the Russian side. How a once upon a time professional journalist can get so much so wrong so quickly, beyond me.
Yeah,
but there we are.
That's Massacre Hirsch. Yeah, he has fallen down. John Helmer, longest serving foreign correspondent in Russia, the only Western journalist to direct his own independent bureau, absent national commercial ties. He is fantastic analyst. You can check his, articles out at Dances with Bears. It is a great publication. It is something that I read all the time. I thank you for this. And I would love to have you back either next week or week after. I never like to bug you week after week because I don't want to overload you, but thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jamal.
Be safe. All right. That was a fantastic breakdown by John. Yeah, I'm riveted by